Hello, I'm Eleanor Payne. Fantastic Books Publishing ran a competition to write a fantasy horror story based on this picture. I thought about it for quite a long time and then produced an horrific story with a fantasy time travel slant. Then, with the competition deadline rapidly approaching, I wondered if I could think of a second story taking a very different look at the same picture. I came up with Open Prison, but because it was more of a dystopian science fiction story rather than fantasy horror, I nearly didn't send it in. But I'm glad I did, because it finished fourth overall in the competition. My horror story, Pandora's Diamond, was longlisted, and both were included in the final anthology published in 2022 under the title Dread Cold. It's being sold in aid of the charities Anti-Slavery International and Embrace the Middle East, and you can find a link below. Fantastic Books Publishing have also published my science fiction novel, A Suggestion in Space, and I've posted a link for that too. And now, Open Prison. Many prisoners feel hard done by, that they are kept in their cells for most of the day, bored with nothing to do and no access to the outside. But Granton couldn't complain about that. He had the outdoors and he had a creative job, but he would have gladly swapped his art and fresh air for the most squalid prison that Earth could offer. A flat sheet of black rock, divided into hexagons like an endless giant's causeway, stretched out before him. He looked up at the sun. Its gentle light was warm and soothing, but he shook his fist at it. Damn you, why are you always in the same place? Can't you rise and set like a proper sun? How can I ever feel that I've done a day's work if a day never ends? He forgot how many times he tried to end it all, but it was as hopeless as Groundhog Day. He tried diving headfirst into the rock, but the Medibots had appeared as if by magic, put him back together and pumped him full of immortality juice. He tried not eating and drinking, but as soon as he started to weaken, his mechanical friends appeared with tubes to force feed him. The occasional suicide attempt took away some of the tedium, but trying to kill yourself never feels nice, and he knew it was impossible to succeed. Facing the sun and looking away to his left, he could just make out a refreshment station, but he would have to finish the section he was on to take advantage of it. Meals didn't come at set times, only when he was able to complete a certain amount of work. By counting up the meals he'd had and the number of times he'd slept, he reckoned he'd been there about 5,000 days, and it would take around another 10,000 to complete his task. At the end of it all, he would still have the body of a 20-year-old, but what use would that be if he couldn't return to Earth and couldn't be with Carrie again? As he worked towards his next break, he thought, as he often did, about Carrie and their clandestine relationship. It would never have worked in the long run, of course. She was a wealthy heiress who lived in a faux castle built by her father, who had made a fortune trading carbon credits and operating space launch vehicles that fell through a loophole in the energy control regulations. Granton was an estate worker with barely enough emissions allowance to keep the lights on in his cabin that he shared with the tools of his trade. It wasn't his fault that he'd seen her swimming one day while he was out clearing undergrowth in the woods. She'd slipped out from underneath the noses of her bodyguards to get a bit of time to herself one hot summer's day. His first thought, when he'd seen her in the lake, had been to get as far away as possible, but instead he stood spellbound as she swam languidly back and forth before rising out of the water, the sun shining directly behind her, so that she was almost a silhouette in front of a dazzling light bouncing off the rippled surface. "Oh, hi, Granton," she said, picking up a large towel off a rock. "I didn't expect to see you here. You know my name, we've never really met." "Of course," she said. "We've not been introduced, but I've seen you in the register of employees, and I'm sure you know who I am." "Yes, Miss Ames Dyson." "Carrie, please. You look very hot and sweaty. Why don't you strip off and join me?" And that's how it had all started. He was sure afterwards that she had engineered their meeting, but never mind. It had been a wild and exciting time, going by different routes to remote parts of the estate, swimming together, sharing picnics hidden in meadows of tall flowers, and making love under the stars. But however careful they were, he knew that they couldn't get away with it forever. Daddy would never allow his darling daughter to consort with the likes of Granton, however much she wanted him. As summer turned to winter, they decided to take the risky step of meeting in his cabin late at night. Granton waited. He'd saved up a week's heating allowance and stopped up all the cracks, letting in drafts to get his single room up to a reasonable temperature. At 2 a.m, there was a knock on the door, and Carrie staggered in out of the wind, brushing snow off her fur coat. "Bloody hell, it's freezing in here," she said. "Can't you get the heating up any more than this?" "It's locked," he said. "I've used up all my ration." "I'll soon fix that," she said. "I'll transfer you some of mine." After a few taps and swipes on her phone, his heater was pouring out so much hot air that it felt like summer again. "With a bit of heat on, it's quite nice in here," she said, throwing off a couple of layers of exquisite alpaca wool sweaters. "What are these on the wall?" "Oh, they're just a few paintings I did around the estate." "They're really good. I like this one of a castle. That's my bedroom window there." "Unfortunately, I'll only ever see it from the outside," he said. "It's nothing to write home about. This bed looks pretty good to me." He sat on the ground, eating his meal, remembering. Nothing had happened to her, of course. His punishment had seemed harsh. Transportation for receiving stolen goods in the form of electricity and fraudulent transfer of carbon credits. The energy required to send him to this distant planet had been far greater than all the energy he'd used in his life before, proving as ever there was one rule for the rich and one for the poor. Meal over, he checked the paint pots on the handcart and then studied the intricate chart in the large book on a shelf next to the handles. He looked back along where he'd just been, made a note in the book, and then moved forward, painting each hexagonal section of rock from a different container. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen, Ames Dyson Castle in Winter by Granton, the only painting in the universe visible from space. Granton spent decades working his way across a basalt pavement with an area of hundreds of square kilometres, painting each small section a different colour or leaving it black so that from a distance it all fits together like pixels in a photograph. We'll see more detail as we get closer to the ground. The passengers in the space shuttle looked out in wonder as their craft spiralled down to 10 kilometres above the ground. The picture spread out before them in fantastic detail. Each frosty twig, each brick in the castle wall, and each crevice in the mountains was meticulously represented above hazy reflections in the water of a lake edged by thin ice. "If you look very carefully in the bottom right corner," said the tour guide, "you can see where Granton has made the dedication for Carrie." "What happened to Granton?" asked a young woman, her face a swirl of rainbow-coloured makeup following the latest craze. When he completed his sentence, he was seen going into the mountains to the south. But after that, no one knows where he went. It's unlikely he could have survived there anyway. There was nothing to look after him now. No medibots or refreshment stations to come to his aid. He'd taken all the food he could carry and climbed until he reached a high cliff overlooking his masterpiece. For all his care, he was afraid that somewhere along the way he'd made a mistake and that different parts of his picture would not line up properly. He could only see it at an oblique angle. Haze obscured some of the details, but so far as he could tell, it was perfect. It would have been easy for him to have deliberately messed up the commission forced on him by Ames Dyson, but for the sake of art and for Carrie, he'd done his best. What now, he thought? There was a small colony on the planet, but he didn't have the resources to reach it. Had it all been worth it? He'd enjoyed a magical summer with a beautiful young woman. He travelled beyond the solar system, and he had completed the largest work of art ever produced by a single person. Not bad, I suppose, he said to himself. He took a lingering look across his masterpiece and then stepped off a cliff.